Well, thank you all for joining us right before dinner. Hopefully we won't hold you too long. So today we're going to be chatting about technology transfer that is developed in the university and then transferred into a spin out. And as we all know, universities can be bastions for innovation and often play a critical role in the innovation ecosystem. And many of the companies here are, use technology from universities, so will be very relevant. So without further ado, I think we can get into introductions. So Grace, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So Grace Katzschmann, I'm the Chief Operating Officer of Nanoflex Robotics. We're a tele-robotics startup coming out of Switzerland, and we're a spin-out from ETH Zurich, which is the leading research university in continental Europe. And before that, I was at PureTech Health in Boston, so I spent 12 years here in the US, loved it. And it was one of those VCs where we were really just sourcing deals from academia and building out the companies from scratch. And even before that, I did my graduate school at MIT and spun out a company from there as well.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Freed. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Flow Medical. We just presented here about 30 minutes ago, so thanks for those of you that stuck around in this room. We are a spin-out from University of Chicago, where I'm also adjunct faculty, and this is my second University of Chicago spin-out. My first company was a surgery software company called Explorer Surgical that we were also at LSI with a number of years ago. So. Going through it twice, you'd think it would get easier. I wish I could say that was the case, but still a lot of fun and great to be a part of the wonderful institution.
Well, thank you for having me on the panel. I'm Greg Fischer. I'm the CEO and founder of Medical Robotics, and we're bringing to market a MRI-compatible surgical robot that's intended to allow real-time MRI to be used during surgical procedures. And the whole purpose behind this is to be able to account for intraoperative brain shift and tissue shift that can and does happen during surgery. And it allows you to have substantially greater precision while at the same time reducing costs and improving efficiencies. This works based on about 15 years and about $15 million of NIH-funded research that I led as PI in an academic setting. So my PhD work was related to MRI-guided interventions at Johns Hopkins. I had a faculty position at Worcester Polytechnic Institute. As I said, we led several large NIH R01 grants related to putting MRI to guide surgical robots to use real-time soft tissue imaging to guarantee you do these procedures right. And then as of about a year ago, I took a role as CEO, and I've taken a leave of absence from the university, and we have tech transfer agreement where we've exclusively licensed all of this IP into the company. And then the last thing I want to mention also is while wearing my academic hat before shifting to the company, we started a large medtech accelerator called Practice Point, funded by the state of Massachusetts, and where we dropped essentially an entire clinical environment, including an MRI scanner, operating rooms, manufacturing environments in the engineering setting. And while I've passed the reins on leading that, my company is actually situated in this. So we have essentially our own MRI scanner down the hall from us. We can run animal studies, cadaver studies, and do all of these types of things. So it's been a really great partnership with the university.
Hi, I'm Andrew Bochner. I'm the managing partner of Bochner PLLC. We're a law firm of about 40 attorneys. I focus on licensing agreements as well as portfolio development. Prior to this, I was general counsel of a Medtech company, made up mostly of in-licensed tech, and dealt significantly with a variety of universities, as well as a CEO that needed a lot of hand-holding, and tried to take that today and give some pointers on it.
What a great panel. So I guess I can introduce myself as well. So I'm Sam Scofield. I'm an investor at Good Growth Capital. We invest across the life sciences, split about 50% in medical technology, 50% in biotechnology. We often invest at the earliest stages in companies, the pre-seed, seed, Series A, and typically, we're investing in frequently, often in the academic spin-outs. So it's common that we're thinking about this, and so. I think something like 20 to 30 of our companies are academic spin-outs. So, great to be here. So I think one of the first things that might be great to just kind of set the stage with is, what are some of the advantages you guys think about when, developing new technologies, specifically in a university or academic setting?
All right, I can start. So for Nanoflex Robotics, we're spinning out of ETH Zurich, And we're in the great position where ETH has its own accelerator called VIS Zurich. And so we literally moved 100 meters down the road from the lab where it was invented. So I would say for us, like the access to infrastructure and the access to expertise has been the two biggest things. It might seem small, but the fact that you have the bench tests that the PhD student has been developing for the last 5 years right there in your reach. You don't have to try and replicate it. You don't have to try and find a CRO to replicate it, but you can just go right back to the lab and do those experiments continuously. That saves so much time. And the other thing I really love is that a university is just a hotbed of like intellects and ideas. And so we, as a robotics system, we know, okay, we have our magnetic navigation technology that's core, but in order to start doing telerobotics and to start, building out a whole new clinical workflow and things like that, it's going to take so much more partnership. And we've been able to find really great partners within the university to help us along. And I think, there are other people on this panel that can also resonate with that. So the best example I have right now is we need a new internet for our system to work, right? Okay, the internet right now, it works, but it's just not very reliable. So when you want to do robotic surgery, you just need to make sure, robotic surgery at distance, you got to make sure your internet's reliable and it's secure. And we found out that a lab next door basically had its own spin out as well, doing exactly this, and they've rolled it out for Swiss banking, and now, we're the perfect test case to roll it out in the US as well. So, that's just an example of one of the great partnerships that can come out from this cross-disciplinary, cross-departmental collaborations in a university setting.
Yeah, I think universities are a great breeding ground for new companies, especially in healthcare and the life sciences. And, I came from the business school, and what I loved about University of Chicago when I started my first company when I was a graduate student there is they would create all these programs to say, let's take physicians and scientists and researchers from other parts of the university and connect them with business school students. So I could be the dumb MBA that was working with all of these great inventors and scientists where they were taking their actual research or, in our current case, actual patient care and saying, let's innovate upon it. So I love it as a breeding ground for new ideas and taking people with different backgrounds and skill sets to put them together to build companies. And then there's, so many opportunities, especially in terms of early stage funding, that's offered to early stage companies that are within a university setting, right? If you think about different government grants, university grants, research grants, this is an amazing place to, start a new healthcare company.
Yes, there's certain things that engineering schools and universities are really good at, and there's certain things that companies are really good at, and it's really important to have that mix. So when I give my pitch presentations, more often than not, I'm talking about the business side of things and the clinical side of things. It's really hard to put robots inside an MRI scanner, and actually as an engineer it pains me not to talk about it in all of these presentations, but that's what the last 20 years we've been working on, doing this development. We've had substantial NIH funding. This is the kind of stuff that really goes really well in the university setting, but then when you get to the next trial of how do you get ready to do your IDEs or getting ready for FDA approvals or getting ready for clinical trials, that doesn't fit into the model very well of this is my PhD student's dissertation project, right? It's a tremendous amount of time. There's not really a research component. So it's really good to understand what are the advantages. So working with the university, we can solve a lot of these technical challenges, and then the company is really good at taking this semi kind of sort of working robot that was good enough to get publications and grants, and then take it to that next level of how do you actually make a clinically viable device and marketable device out of it. And then the other side of this, not just partnering with engineering schools, but we've had really good luck partnering with the medical schools. So the Brigham and Women's Hospital is one of our key partners. We're looking to do first in human trials there, but even just a lot of testing, development, you mentioned grant proposals, right? All of these things, there's huge opportunities. So working both with the medical schools and the engineering schools has been really instrumental for us.
Andrew, just curious, because I know you work with a variety of different companies, whether they're academic spinouts or not. What's your perspective on those that have IP that was generated from an academic setting versus those that are company generated?
I'd say that usually that first round of IP is pretty strong. more so than from, let's say, industry. It's backed by years and years of research. You usually have an inventor that's very passionate about it in terms of the professor, whoever, the postdoc, whoever it may be. The good tech transfer offices are often very supportive of taking that and, particularly in the US, licensing it out, trying to find a landing for that, and hopefully getting it into industry.
Yeah, so I guess that brings us to the next question, which, I think there's obviously technology that's being developed at universities, and we always think about, as investors, is this technology, is this a product, is this a company? And so thinking about, as that progresses, do you spin out or do you, license to a big strategic? But I guess in the case of all of your companies that have successfully spun out, what's your advice around timing the spin out? What's the best time, and how do you think about that process?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people who have opined in this big question is a really key one. I think one thing, of course, is that they've identified the right application, right? So a lot of scientists, they have a core technology, and all they need to do for a publication, because the incentives in academia is you get to a publication, and it just needs to look new, and it needs to look good for maybe, say, one video. Then for a company, it doesn't necessarily have to be completely new, but it needs to be really repeatable. It needs to be able to fill a customer's need, right? And it needs to be profitable. So for our technology and magnetic navigation, we had proof of concepts from the research lab in the eye, in the womb, in blood vessels. There were so many places where we could use this. And it took us a really long time to talk to clinicians and talk to reimbursement, to the payers, to figure out what would be the sweet spot. So, eventually we settled on the application in stroke and magnetic navigation of devices into the brain to treat stroke. But, identifying that correct application, that was really crucial for us being able to go forward and to really have a focused plan.
Yeah, I think there's, clinical and development milestones, but also, I think from the business side, oftentimes it coincides when you're ready to have a full-time CEO running the business. So, that generally comes when, one, you either have enough funding or you're ready to go out and raise funding, because VCs like you generally like to see a full-time CEO at the helm of the business, not somebody that's working on a company 20% of the time. They need to know who's running it. But, I think a lot of that comes with, hey, what have you done to de-risk it, right? So what research have you done? Do you feel that it's viable, not just from a clinical or scientific perspective, but, is this a viable company, and are we ready to go out and say we're going to put salaries and jobs at risk of the funding of the company versus just the funding of the research?
Yes, I think what I found is, working in the university setting is this de-risking, but to me it's on the technical side. So what we're doing is really a big jump from, what's been done before. We're really using brand new technologies, everything from designing our own motors to our own motor drivers to the electronics, the navigation, the communication protocols. It's a complete new ground up from the ground up system. So having something like this that's effectively technically de-risked in the university setting, that means when you start to go to commercialize it, you can actually have a full end-to-end system that you can demonstrate, and now the company's focused on taking that and bringing it to that next level of how do you actually create a product out of it. On the university side, you may not spend as much time in figuring out what's the clinical need, what's the right application that we brought up here. So for us, we've really started to narrow our focus on deep brain stimulation, where actually in the academic side it was focused on oncology. Ultimately the robot can hit all of these, but which is the right, first market. But just in general, I think the company is really good at taking these ideas and bringing them from what essentially is a technical feasibility stage to a commercial product.
Yeah, and Jennifer, I know you touched on it. Just the team is such a critical part in what investors are looking at. You hear that again and again, and a professional CEO, when's the right time to bring that in? And I think, Greg, really interested to hear your perspective on this as someone who has an academic background and is an academic founder. What do you see as the role? And obviously there's different playbooks, but just be good to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, so for me, it was like this was the right time. So I said, we've been working on this for quite a while, and we got to a point where it works. And I was just so enthusiastic, so excited about this. And I've been a professor for the last 15 years. I'm a full tenured professor with grants and everything. And I took a complete leave from the university and jumped full time in because I really believe that, look, this is the time. The technology is there, but also the market is ready for this, right? You start to see a lot more interest in real-time imaging from a host of companies across the board. In fact, a lot of the companies here are all about how can we use some sort of image guidance to guarantee you do these procedures right. So, like, this is the right time to be doing this. So, I was just really excited to, really take this to the next level. So, it all comes down to, like, what is the, right timing and the right people. So we're still partnered with the university. We're actually based in the Medtech accelerator that I founded even though I moved on. So it's nice that I'm still in that same active environment. You talked about that before. So I'm still working and at least seeing in the hallway all the faculty. In fact, since I took over as CEO, we've actually licensed 3 patents from a former colleague of mine so that we can start expanding into ultrasound-guided procedures as well. So I think just being in that environment is incredibly valuable. And we've also actually have 2 PhD students that are now, through a sponsored research agreement, effectively working for the company or doing R&D for the company. So I think there's a really good way to be working together on this.
And when you do, stay on, which I think is a sort of a rare occurrence, we don't see that very often, but certainly a great one. I think what are some of the roles that companies need to think about for bringing outside help in? What types of functions? If it's not, well, maybe it is a professional CEO, but if you're an academic founder, what type of support do you need if you're going to stay on as a CEO?
I think it's so company dependent, right? And I also want to clarify my comment. It isn't to say everybody should have a separate outside CEO. I think companies should be founder-led, right? I mean, the founders and inventors of the technology are going to be the ones that so innately understand the problem. They know it. I mean, it's in their heart, like this is what they want to build. But I also think every founding team at a certain point is going to say, what's in my wheelhouse and what's not? Where do I need support? So with my last company, which is a surgery software company, I was a business school student. I had a background in venture and finance. My co-founder was a surgeon. Neither one of us had a technology background. And so our first hire was bringing in a chief technology officer that had this really deep software background. So I think it's all about, as a founding team, saying, okay, where are our gaps? And being self-aware enough to say we know what those gaps are, and let's bring in the best and brightest executives to come in and complement our team. And that's, what I think you start to see with some of these early stages. And, there are occasions where you're going to have multidisciplinary founders. Sometimes it's going to be a very scientific team, sometimes a very physician-heavy team. And then at different stages, you say, what else do we need? And you go out and you find that, talent.
I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head there of really being self-aware and understanding what you know and what you don't know. And I think this is where some, faculty-led startups may have trouble, where you think you know everything. I mean, it's been really valuable finding the right people to help us and finding the right, business people, finding the right clinical partners, finding the right manufacturing partners. And, you just need to be able to build the right team and be humble and realize, look, there are a lot of people that are experts at this and bringing together that all-star team so you can take it to that next level.
Andrew, curious, when is the right time to bring in an IP attorney, and what do you see as kind of the major value of that for early stage companies?
Well, from a university spin-out, probably predates the company. So it's usually the university doing it, but obviously at the licensing stage or the spin-out stage. So I think everyone here has spun out from and licensed from their own academic institution, but just as much are people approaching another academic institution that they don't have involvement in. So you pretty much need an IP attorney when you're doing that license, and best not to go to your IP attorney 2 weeks before you want to sign and say, okay, let's get going here, because as pretty much everyone knows, universities move at a glacial pace at best.
So for the CEOs on the stage, in your experience, what have investors, typically looked for when evaluating your companies as it pertains to, the IP and the, technology that's been developed at a university?
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think, for any company that's licensed their technology out of a university, like you have to have the license agreement in the data room, right? So the investors are going to go in, they're going to want to see that, they're going to want to see the terms. And the big thing they're going to be looking for are, hey, are there going to be any terms that are going to be a major problem down the road for a strategic acquirer? So, for us, like we brought in our own IP counsel very early to review that license agreement to know that, hey, we're probably still going to end up modifying this down the road, right? They're almost never untouched, but you want to have that in place. And then I think also thinking about as a company, have you done an FTO, right? What's your IP strategy? And so for us, we found it to be really helpful to have our own IP counsel and work very closely with the University of Chicago's IP team as we engage investors.
Yeah, so, I mean, going back to my experience with PureTech Health, which was spinning companies out of academia, I mean, investors, I think a lot of people in this room are familiar with what investors generally look for in a company. But for academic spin-outs in particular, I remember we would try and identify what was the killer experiment, right, which would either prove the hypothesis that the company had or just, show us that it wasn't true at all. Sometimes it was around mechanism of action. Sometimes it was around whether or not we would get enough bioavailability. But basically identifying what is the killer experiment we had to do, and then we would set up an SRA, a sponsored research agreement with that university to first do that killer experiment, right? And so it was a very easy way for us to, first of all, de-risk the investment for us. But second of all, if the experiment worked, there was often a chance we could also get IP out of it. Because we were sponsoring the research. So I thought that was a really unique way for a VC to be able to work with a university at that stage.
So we talked about the agreements, but I think in terms of what's actually contained in the IP, what I've seen is they're looking for both depth and breadth. And it's really important to have very focused IP around this is what you're building, really protecting exactly what you're making, but also, at least for us, it's very much a platform technology. And what people get excited about is, hey, it's not just a neurorobot. We actually have IP around pretty much anywhere in the body. We want to be sticking, needles inside an MRI scanner, right? And needle steering and all these things that may not actually apply to neurosurgery, but be really useful for, prostate or spine or abdominal, things like that. So I think this idea of being able to show that, look, you actually have an IP portfolio that's much broader, and you don't necessarily know what's going on behind, in the brains of everybody that's reviewing, but they may see in their head different applications beyond what you're doing. So what you see as your killer app may be the first application, but these companies that you're partnering with may actually want to start doing something else. So I think it's really important to make sure you protect what you're making, clear a moat around it to protect what you're doing, but also be able to cover more or less the entire platform or use cases that it could be applied to.
I'll just add that that's usually also a flag, positive flag, but when companies take the license from the university and then they add IP on top of it, that they're developing MOAs or use cases or something like that, and they've continued to develop. Obviously, freedom to operate is critical, but also some of the key business terms like, is there a ROFN that's going to take a year to play through when there's a potential acquisition on the table? Is the agreement assignable or sub-licensable? Those are all things that you're often going to want to look at, and some of those terms may not be something that you can do at the initial license, but knowing that that academic institution is actually pretty flexible when it comes time to it and they can move quickly is also important to investors as well.
And Andrew, in the diligence process with investors, how, if at all, can an IP attorney assist in that process?
Well, obviously, freedom to operate is the biggest key to all of that. Knowing that the company doesn't have infringement risk or has modified infringement risk, also knowing what the landscape is like. And again, just because this happens all the time, not doing that when the deal's on the table, but having that ready to go when the company is starting to shop for investment and things like that. Having all the basic documents in a row, like have inventors actually assigned all their rights to the company. One thing that comes up, we're talking about founder-led companies, is investors want to see that the founder has actually assigned their rights, not that they Adam Newman did, like WeWork, and kept it for themselves. That they've assigned that, and there's a plan that if, let's say, the CEO goes back to academia, they agree to cooperate. There's some sort of employment agreement around that.
And this is for anyone who wants to take it. What advice do you have for CEOs in terms of the kind of best practices around license agreements?
I mean, I can say for us, one of the things that was really important is making sure that they really want to see the company succeed and structure the licenses in a way that's going to make the company, grow. You don't want a company you don't want a license agreement that's essentially going to kill the company with fees, up front. So I know when we set up ours, it was set up in such a stage where there's very little upfront costs, and even the patent reimbursement expenses weren't until you hit certain milestones, and the royalties need to be at a point where minimum royalties, for example, not kicking in for a couple of years. I think we had 3 years before minimum royalties kicked in, and things like that. It's a way to let the company start really growing without that burdening it until you get a little bit further down the road. So I think that's a biggie. And then the other one is making sure you have the sub-licensing agreements, because that's something I've certainly seen interested in, a lot of folks have asked about. So definitely make sure that's in there.
All that, and making sure you get an exclusive global right to use.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yes,
I think
great
what
point.
we all want to know is, Andrew, what are your secrets to going faster?
There you go.
Well, I think it's, again, knowing the university, it's a little counterintuitive, but the top universities are the ones that are most proficient at it, and they've built good tech transfer offices that know how to move. When you look at sort of your B League or C League universities that don't have robust tech transfer offices, they're actually greedier, and they don't know the process. And I had one a few months ago that was a year and a half from when we started negotiations, and they were just too greedy, and the answer is now they're left with an asset they can't do anything with because my client just walked away from it. So know who you're getting into bed with. Know that you're going to have to, there's no perfect license. You're always going to have to go back, renegotiate things, but have an internal process for doing that. And know that when things pick up, it's time to pick up and go to the university and say, hey, we're thinking of doing this. Can we start the discussion?
Yeah, that's great. So I think, let's dive in there a little bit more on kind of the tech transfer offices. I think when people talk about tech transfer offices, it's often the Stanfords and the MITs of the world, and, the really sophisticated tech transfer offices. But, as much as there's great technology being developed at those institutions, there's also great technology being developed at, other institutions. So, what are some of the challenges associated with working with some of these groups, and any advice on navigating those?
I mean, I can just say from our experience, it's important to really know what you want going into this, and you can help lead it. And in fact, with some of the smaller universities, you might actually, in some cases, have more control over that, because they're not necessarily going to have these boilerplate agreements, and they're willing to be more flexible, but you definitely need to know what's important to you when you're going into these agreements and make sure you negotiate that.
I think we all pause because even though we're here on the panel, we still have some PTSD about going through this process. So I wish there was a magic wand, but I think a lot of the advice that was shared, really applies here of, going in, knowing who you're working with, and having some patience too.
I'll add two things. One is speak to people who have dealt with that university before. Know what made them tick, what didn't. At the end of the day, there's a tech transfer officer on the other side, and one office might have one person that's amazing and one person that sucks. And know what it is that they like. Some are just inflexible on certain terms. And I will say this, that lawyers are the worst offenders of this. Get on the phone. Don't email. Just talk through the issues, understand the why they're digging in, as opposed to just seeing them dig in on a term, and maybe it's something you can talk through. But oftentimes, phone calls, even face-to-face, can help get through a lot of that.
Yeah, I think, looking when comparing different tech transfer offices, one big thing to know is how much power does the professor usually have in those negotiations. I think Andrew has lots of experience here, but in my experience, if the professor has a lot of sway, it usually goes quite easy in the end. Like, as long as the professor, as a co-founder, he's motivated to get this technology out of the lab, there's usually a way you can get through. if the university really respects what the professor wants. If not, then yeah, it's kind of an uphill battle.
Yeah, and Grace, I think it would be interesting for the audience to hear. Obviously, spun out of a European-based institution, and so I think curious to hear kind of what you understand to be kind of some of the differences between North American startups that come out of American universities, and what are some of those implications?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing, honestly, for me is the more conservative culture in Europe. I mean, my experience is limited to Switzerland, right? But typically in Europe, you get smaller funding rounds, lower valuation. I actually had an investor say to me, a US investor say to me the other day when I was pitching, say, we usually go to Europe for a discount. And that's what she said after we told her our valuation. So, the conservative culture can make things more difficult in fundraising. But on the other hand, what I've noticed is that by the time the technology gets spun out of the university, it's also a lot more mature because they know they have so much more proof points that they have to meet in order to get people to invest. So interestingly enough, I think in Switzerland, for the startups, the rate of them succeeding is almost double that of in the US. And I wonder if that's actually due to the conservative nature, right? That they know that before they go out there and start asking for money, they have to really have like a fully fleshed out concept in order to attract that funding. So I would say, the pros and cons to it, but in my experience, at least at Nanoflex Robotics, when we came out, it was a fully functional prototype. They had done preclinical trials. There was a huge IP portfolio behind it. And that's really helped us to accelerate much faster than I think a robotic startup in the US typically would have at our age.
So Andrew, I'd be curious just from the perspective of seeing lots of companies go through this process of spinning out and licensing IP. Do you have any examples where things went wrong and something that the audience can learn from those lessons?
Yeah, I'd say, often at the first agreement stage, companies are often scared to negotiate. They think that the deal's going to blow up. The university might walk away, or even in their first deal with industry, whether it's a bigger company, they're afraid to push for what's important for them, and don't be afraid to do that. You're not going to hurt someone's feelings. Usually they just say no. So I'd say getting a little bit outside the comfort zone is important. I think also, as I said before, getting ahead of the curve. So in terms of timing, realizing that especially with tech transfer offices, everything takes time. So if you know you're going to do something in 6 months from now, having a plan, because they don't sign those in a month. Those are probably the two most important things I would flag.
So I'm curious, when you think about industry partnerships, you're focused at an early stage on working with the university to make sure that you have control over the IP. When is the right time to consider industry partnerships, and how do you think about that versus an academic partnership?
I think it depends on what kind of industry partnership you're talking about. I mean, some industry partnerships are much more like an R&D relationship, right? So that's something that as a faculty member we'd be very comfortable with. In fact, I'm very interested in doing some co-development deals and essentially R&D contracts working with large strategic companies, because that's the kind of things that we're actually very comfortable with. So it's a little bit different than the university side, where there you're really trying to develop the technology. Now it's more about taking the technology and making it for a specific application. But if you can find a partner that you want to work with, I mean, that's really going to drive you towards something that is going to be a really good killer app, because they wouldn't be pushing you in that direction and wanting to do that if they didn't see value in that.
Yeah, I think in general, as an early stage medtech company, like engaging with industry early and often across the spectrum and ways to partner with them. And one example relative to this conversation is when we were looking at our license for Flow Medical, which is my new company, which is a PE thrombolysis catheter. I actually called some of my contacts in corporate development at some of the big cardiology companies, and I said, can you help provide me with perspective as a friend on some of these terms? And it was very helpful because they were able to go through the license and say, hey, this all looks pretty good, but here are the two things that would cause me a lot of pause if I were in the situation of acquiring it. And that's where I was able to pick up the phone and talk to the tech transfer office and say, here's the perspective I'm getting. We're all aligned in that we want to see a successful exit. We want to see this, be a structure that works. Let's talk through these specific terms. So I think, experienced folks in industry can be incredibly valuable from, day zero.
Alrighty, I think we are at time. So I appreciate everyone for taking the time at the end of the day, and I'd like to thank my panel as well.
Thank you very much.